The music shells on the Esplanade. There likely would be no music shell at all on the Esplanade if it weren't for Arthur Fiedler. Fiedler was born in Boston. His father was a violinist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra for 35 years, and his mother was a trained pianist. Arthur grew up in Boston and attended Boston Latin School until his father retired and they moved briefly to Vienna and then to Berlin, where Fiedler studied violin at the Royal Academy of Music. At the beginning of World War I, Fiedler returned to Boston and in 1915 joined the Boston Symphony Orchestra as a violinist. He also worked widely as a pianist, organist, and percussionist. Fiedler first led the Pops in Symphony Hall as a replacement conductor during the 1926 season, following the resignation of the conductor. After the success of his first concert, Fiedler asked to be named the permanent conductor, an appointment that instead went to Alfred Casella. Undaunted, Arthur Fiedler decided to organize and conduct his own series of popular concerts, outdoor and for free. After Casella's departure in 1929, the Boston Symphony Orchestra offered Arthur Fiedler a 3-year contract to begin in the 1930 pop season. He stayed for 50 years. During Fiedler's tenure, the orchestra became extremely popular. 5 years after he became conductor, Fiedler found a record of an obscure Danish song in a clearance bin for 15 cents. The release of Jalousie on RCA Victor became the first orchestral recording to sell more than 1 million copies. Ultimately, the orchestra sold more than 50 million recordings, more than any orchestra in history. In 1976, Pop's bicentennial concert on the Esplanade attracted the largest crowd ever to attend a classical music performance. Also under Fiedler, the Pops continued to feature new composers and popular music and was regularly nationally broadcast on radio and TV. In 1953, Boston even honored the conductor by naming a footbridge connecting the concert area of the Esplanade with the Back Bay after him. While Fiedler was extremely popular with the public, some of the orchestra's musicians did not like the light music he loved, and Fiedler's willingness to wear costumes and perform antics for the audience. Arthur Fiedler died of cardiac arrest at his home in Brookline on July 10, 1979, having been unable to attend the 50th July 4th anniversary concert on the Esplanade. Boston honored the conductor again in 1984 with a memorial sculpture by Ralph Helmick. The 6.5-foot depiction of Fiedler's head is composed of 83 plates of aluminum on a granite base and faces the hat shell. Helmick described his work as a layered image that becomes more abstracted as the viewer draws near, providing a visual parallel for the character of the man. The popular outdoor concerts Fiedler promoted still occur in the hat shell today. Arthur Fiedler's connection to the hat shell, in fact all the music shells that ever occupied the Esplanade, is clear. In 1929, Fiedler, a member of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, had formed a chamber music orchestra composed of 22 other BSO members. The group toured New England for several years. This experience convinced Fiedler that outdoor, public, light classical concerts could work and that the Esplanade would be a wonderful setting. Needless to say, many were skeptical of the venture. The very idea of a free public concert of relatively sophisticated music open to all, Beacon Hill residents, residents of the immigrant West End, and people coming in from the suburbs, was considered risky and unlikely to work. But Fiedler was able to convince a sufficient number of Bostonians that it was a good idea. The first Esplanade concerts were funded by what was referred to as the generosity of several prominent Boston men. The summer of 1929 saw Fiedler's dream finally become a reality. He had an orchestra and a stage to perform on. The first shell was a temporary barn-like structure shown in the 2 upper pictures that was made of wood and was rebuilt each year. It cost the state slightly over $3,000 to erect in 1929. The shell actually changed sometimes when it was rebuilt. For example, in the picture you see a building was added for the use of the musicians and event staff. On July 4, 1929, 46 musicians appeared with Fiedler to play the very first piece in the shell, Stars and Stripes Forever. Despite concern about the behavior of the so-called lower classes of the West End, the newspaper reported that the audience was as quiet as Symphony Hall. Only a few hundred people attended that first concert, driven more by heat than music, they say. The horribly windy weather threatened the wooden shell and blew the musicians' scores around. Musicians shared scores and worried that the tonal quality of their music was being ruined by the wind and the wooden shell. They went home thinking the concert had been a failure. Instead, they woke up the next day to find out that they were a public hit and were being hailed as a new step in musical entertainment and education. By the end of the first season, which ran almost nightly for 4 weeks, many wanted more. Fiedler, however, was reluctant to go back to his donors. Indeed, it was a successful first season. The concerts were broadcast on the radio 4 times during the season, programs and published in the Globe weekly, and 20,000 people showed up for the last concert on August 7th. And so began a Boston tradition. Even during the worst of the Depression years, the concerts continued. It was certainly hard to raise funds during the Depression. At each concert, there were 3 collection boxes and chairs were rented for 10 cents apiece. About $500 was needed to support each concert. Fiedler often started without complete season funding. Each week, the Globe published a funding total and its list of donors. The Shell continued to receive complaints from the performers. In attempts to solve the problem of the annual rebuilding, as well as the acoustical inadequacies of the structure, a crew covered the structure in concrete in 1933, which unfortunately destroyed it. The second Shell, erected in 1934, was designed by architect Harold Field Kellogg and MIT professor and acoustic specialist W.R. Bars. The new Art Deco design featured a steel shell with wood sheathing on the interior. The rigidity of the steel was meant to eliminate the undesirable booming qualities of the old shell, according to a Globe article. The wood sheathing inside would preserve the tone quality of the music, and the air chamber between the wood and the steel was meant to enhance the tone, similar to the principle used in the construction of a cello. You can clearly see the air chamber in the newspaper photo on the left, which shows the shell under construction for the first time. Importantly, the shell was also designed to be dismantled at the end of each season and later reassembled for the next. During the next several years, the concerts continued with a schedule of 4 weeks in July and August and grew in popularity with 225,000 to 260,000 attendees each season. And Fiedler continued to innovate. In 1938, Fiedler initiated morning children's concerts. There were 3 that year at 10 a.m. 1938 is also the year the BSO Pops Orchestra officially took over the concerts, though the public fundraising continued. Unfortunately, this music shell also proved inadequate. It was small, and the steel frame made the musicians swelter on hot summer days, despite the fact that the shell had an open rear facade to alleviate the heat. In 1938, the plan for the permanent shell was announced. The state sold the existing shell to Boston for $1, with a plan to move it to East Boston's Wood Island Park. Boston had to pay for the dismantlement and the moving cost. It was hoped that the new permanent shell would be complete in time for the 1939 season. However, the project was delayed, and in September of 1938, a rare hurricane raced through New England, blowing out the wooden back of the shell. It was repaired and used for the 1939 season. In the fall of 1939, it was finally relocated to East Boston, where it was used for another 25 years. Finally destroyed in 1964 by renovations made to the park and the undertaking of an expansion at Logan Airport. The first permanent music shell is the Edward Hatch Memorial Shell that we all know today. The shell was funded from the bequest of Maria Hatch. Maria lived with 2 of her 3 siblings, her brother Edward and her sister Lucy, in a house on Commonwealth Avenue. Their brother Edward died in 1910, leaving his estate to his sisters. The sisters continued to live together on Comm Ave until their deaths, only 13 days apart, in 1926. Maria, being the last surviving sister, inherited the estate. In her will, Maria Hatch set aside $300,000 in trust for a memorial to be created in honor of her brother Edward. It would be, quoting from the will, a public beauty spot with such buildings, fountains, roadways, walks, or other works, trees, shrubs, and flowers that may best carry out the intent of this gift. The executor of Maria's estate invested wisely, almost doubling its value in 9 years, but he did nothing to achieve the desire expressed in Maria's will. In 1935, that executor died, and there was no provision to ensure the continued trusteeship of the Hatch funds. In January 1936, Attorney General Deaver, later Governor Deaver, took the matter to probate court and had 2 new trustees appointed, William Hickey Jr. and John Burke. Burke and Hickey explored several options for the trust funds, most notably a planetarium, but it quickly became apparent that the funds were inadequate for such a large project. Instead, Burke and Hickey decided to fund Fiedler's project of a permanent shell on the Esplanade. In the final donation negotiations with the state, in addition to Mrs. Hatch's request for a beauty spot, Burke and Henry specified that the structure be used for musical and artistic purposes of general public interest and entertainment, except, however, it shall not be used for sectarian, political, or controversial purposes. In 1938, Burke and Hickey hired architect Richard Shaw. A graduate of the Harvard School of Design, Shaw, with his business partner Timothy O'Connor, designed and constructed the shell. Shaw designed many area churches, but unquestionably, the Hatch Shell Memorial became his best-known architectural work. Shaw's design, very much like the second version of the shell, consisted of a classic Art Deco series of parallel, diminishing shells behind a proscenium stage. It was all carefully crafted to ensure improved acoustical quality. The postcard on the left shows the Hatch shell shortly after its completion. Actually, all these postcards I've shown you here, and most of this, are from the Esplanade Association's collection. The 2 postcards on the right show some of the differences between the second music shell on the top and the hat shell on the bottom. The hat shell has a similar Art Deco design, but it's much larger than the 1934 music shell. In fact, it's roughly 3 times as large. It includes several rooms beneath the stage, including enclosed practice and dressing spaces. And the materials used are much stronger, as it's meant to be permanent. The exterior also features a brown terrazzo covering a concrete base and a large polished granite proscenium. The oval was also redesigned to make it larger and was encircled by trees to cut down on some of the noise. Construction of the shell began in September 1939 after the old shell was removed. The structure was first framed in wood and stood idle until January, when it was filled with concrete. Construction of the interior continued through the spring of 1940, and the landscaping continued right up until the opening in July. The Globe reported that the shell would accommodate 150 musicians. If you recall, the first one handled about 50 and the second at about 60, and the oval lawn was expanded to accommodate larger crowds, 12,000 versus 8,000 of the prior oval. It was also reported that the roof would be covered in crushed garnet. The final design, however, topped the roof with terrazzo. Final cost was over $300,000, including landscaping, compared with the $8,000 of the prior shell. No expense was spared on the surrounding grounds around the shell, as Maria Hatch her will called explicitly for a public spot of beauty. Arthur Shercliffe, who designed the major landscape changes in the park in the mid-1930s, also designed the landscape around the shell. Thousands of dollars were spent on landscaping, only for much of it to be destroyed about 10 years later with the opening of Storrow Drive in 1951. At its opening on July 2, 1940, the Hat Show was celebrated by more than 20,000 people, including Burke and Hickey, the executors of Maria Hatch's estate, former Governor Fuller, and Boston Mayor Maurice Tobin. Arthur Fiedler unveiled the plaque marking the structure. To this day, the Hat Show remains an important landmark and a gathering space for the city of Boston. In 1991, the state funded a $5 million renovation and repair of the hat shell and modernization of its acoustics. The black vinyl roof installed earlier to stop leaks was removed, the terrazzo roof was resurfaced, and the 710 bronze letters spelling the 87 composer names were restored. Bostonian Howard Brickman, a master craftsman specializing in wood floors, recreated each of the 20,000 pieces of teak paneling in the shell by hand. Added were an elevator, a computer-controlled sound system, state-of-the-art lighting, and 2 11-foot-tall bronze speaker cabinets. The speakers were added due to the noise intrusion of Storrow Drive, which hadn't existed when the shell was originally sited. In 2015, the Esplanade Association undertook a $750,000 project to improve the hat shell lawn. The soil was heavily compacted after years of use, and there were numerous bare patches. The restoration required removing and replacing much of the soil, installing high-use grass that would better withstand the crowds. We also installed a drainage system to protect the groundwater beneath the lawn, and a state-of-the-art irrigation system that provides much-needed water both to the turf and to the soil to help it resist compaction. In addition, electrical and mechanical conduits were installed to improve and modernize infrastructure for music and video performances. All the preparatory work was completed in the fall of 2014, with a special sod to be laid out in the spring of 2015, and plenty of time for the sod to root and stabilize before July 4th. However, a heavy snow cover that season, 108 inches had fallen, threatened the opening of the lawn. Luckily, the Red Sox ground crew faced the same issue, and they were happy to provide advice when we reached out. Following their lead, we added black sand cover over the area, which speeded up the melting of the snow. July 4th celebrations took place as planned on a brand new lawn. The roof started leaking again in 2016, and a $2.4 million project to reconstruct and waterproof the roof took place in 2018. The 2018 work involved demolition of the old outer shell material and then patching and cleaning of the concrete beneath so that the waterproofing could be applied. It also required quite a bit of technical and exacting work. 2 laser scans of the dome were conducted to pinpoint imperfections in the covering and to determine the exact elevation of the various shaped terrazzo panels that would be attached to the concrete dome. Ground-penetrating radar was utilized to locate existing reinforcements so that the new anchors would be drilled into the concrete dome and would not impact the embedded reinforcements in the cast-in-place concrete structure. Finally, the 3-inch thick precast panels can be attached. The panels were fabricated in 91 different shapes and fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. By the way, the panels averaged 3 feet by 4 feet in size and weighed 350 to 550 pounds. Over the years, the Hat Shell has been host to a wide range of events, many of which returned year after year. This slide shows what I'm sure is not an all-inclusive list of events that took place at the Hat Show beginning in the 70s. Most of these no longer occur as the costs of production and security have increased greatly over time. The 5 items in the rightmost column all still occur every year at the Hat Show. the Boston Pops July 3rd and July 4th concerts. Also, the Boston Landmarks Orchestra has a weekly concert series in the summer. About a dozen charity walks either use the Esplanade as part of their route or begin or conclude at the Hatch Shell itself. Groundbeat's a relatively new series started by the Esplanade Association in 2018 to bring more diverse music and artists to the Hatch Shell stage. And Friday Flicks has brought family-friendly movies to the Hatch Shell for 34 years.